we're so thrilled that Zoe's here. Zoe is doing such amazing work around the ethical philosophy that has to do with biotechnology. And as the world of plants evolves, so does the world of man's impulse to intervene in the systems of plants with biotechnology and genetic modification, and with all kinds of intentions to, there's a big initiative now with the Salk Institute to change the genetic composition of plants so that they would sequester more carbon. So a good intention around wanting to solve climate change. There are genetic modification or breeding programs at non-genetic modification breeding programs to create more delicious plants, to make plants more appealing. But it's interesting because with all of this race and urgency that we need to have to address climate change and human health issues, there are a lot of, there's some context that we felt is really important to bring in, and Professor Robaey is really at the forefront of this. We're delighted you're here. Thanks for staying up late with us. It's not quite, just after dinner time in the Netherlands, right? So without further ado, Zoe, welcome.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you, Sam, and the whole team for inviting me today. So yes, I'm from Wageningen University. It's a G, and it's pronounced with a hard G, and I'm an assistant professor in Ethics of Technology. And I know today we're all, like pretty much every day, sitting behind our screens and looking at people in different places talking from their living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, home offices. So I want to invite you to do something a little bit physical. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen, I would like you to write what is the meaning of innovation for you and the meaning of responsibility. So just take a second to jot down your first thoughts about what is innovation and what is responsibility. I'm just going to pause for a few seconds. So I hope you have some ideas that come quickly to your head when you think about these words. And I want to take a step back and look at what innovation means. So innovation is something we value. And why do we value it? We value because innovation provides solution to problems. So innovation helps us make things better. But historically, innovation wasn't always seen as something good. Philosopher Benoit Godin outlines in his book, Innovation Contested, how different societies perceived the concept of innovation through history. And in Roman times, innovation was seen as something bad and disruptive. Today, innovation is seen as something disruptive and good. And it's interesting because through history, we've expanded our moral realm and our moral norms as we learn about the world. So today, things that are obvious to us were not so obvious to earlier generations. And we often see that in our moral realms, while as a society we find out what we find right or wrong, we find that it changes before our laws and institutions change. So you can be certain of one thing, is that people 100 years in the future from now will look back at us today and see a lot of things that we did, where we did our best, but it was probably wrong in some way or another. So I look specifically at technologies and technologies in the field of agriculture. And when it comes to assessing impacts of new technologies, we think often of unintended consequences. So things we couldn't have predicted. So we did a choice today for something we thought was good, and we find out later on that maybe it wasn't all that good. And one of the things I argue about this problem of ignorance and unintended consequences is that even if we don't know everything, we have ways to try to do the right thing. And one of these ways is by trying to find out more. So I'm going to explain to you today a little bit more what I mean with that, what it means to have the responsibility to try and find out more, even if we think we might not be able to. So I'm going to present 3 cases and explain what is salient about those cases in terms of how an innovation could have been different, can be different, and could be different. So it's one case is something that has already happened. It's about a company called Ecover. I don't know if they're big in the US, but they're very big in Europe. And I brought a bottle. So they make cleaning products for consumers. And they pride themselves in being extremely sustainable in looking for the latest innovations and solutions for clean products. And a few years ago, they decided to switch one component in their detergent, which was palm oil, to an algae oil produced out of synthetic biology processes. When they did this, they looked at the environmental impact of palm oil versus this synthetically produced algae oil, and the algae oil was a lot better. I don't have to remind you, I think, of the problems around palm oil, because we know that intensive exploitation of palm oil is destroying natural habitats of animals like orangutans. However, this shift that this company did at the time created a lot of outcry, and people were not happy about it. And when I say people, I mean consumers, because consumers chose Ecover because it was a sustainable product, and the use of genetic engineering didn't fit in their ideas of what was sustainable. And also from civil society groups who said, but what about the palm oil farmers? What happens to them if we switch then to this consumption? So here what you see in this case is the displacement of the problem. So we go from a problem about nature conservation to a problem about livelihoods. We go from a problem of more sustainability to a problem of what's the place of genetic engineering in sustainability, and consumer perceptions and feelings about it. And this is a case that my colleagues at TU Delft, Lotte Asveld, have worked on. And you see same dynamics shaping around the synthetic production of vanilla. Another case I want to mention, so this is the case where things could have gone differently, and I will explain, I will come back to what could have gone differently. The other case I want to mention is a case I got recently interested in, and it's not yet a very big case, but it could become a big case, and it's about synthetic coffee production. So coffee produced via bio-based means, not chemical processes, but bio-based processes. And there's a few companies, not many, but they're looking into how to produce coffee without the coffee bean. And for me, this was really interesting, because I was wondering, so if we produce coffee without the coffee bean, what is the role of the coffee bean anymore? And if you think about the role of agriculture and cultivating crops, one, it's a carbon sink. Two, it's part of cultural practices, and it's part of our common of our heritage of humankind. And I discussed this case with a colleague in a paper we're working on at the moment. And we see, when we do this anticipation exercise, we see a potential risk that in the long run, if those bio-based processes become too successful and more affordable and more environmentally friendly, where will the heritage of making coffee, what will happen of it? What will happen to farmers who have developed varieties of coffee beans over the years? And how are we going to preserve that? How are we going to conserve that? So it's not only about labor, but it's also about culturally relevant crops. So this is the one where things can still happen differently if we talk about them. The third case is also a hypothetical case, and it's not about plants, but it's linked to the protein transition. And this is a case that my colleague at Wageningen University, Cor van Robaey, works on, and it's about in vitro meat production. With in vitro meat production, there's a lot of questions for the consumers, so how do they feel about it? But there's also a lot of questions for the farmers. So what will the farmers do if they're not cattle farmers anymore, if they're not pig farmers anymore? And what happens then to those animals if we produce meat in a petri dish, in a bioreactor? And my colleague develops a scenario that she calls pig in the backyard, where people can have a personal relationship with an animal and biopsies are taken and then used to produce synthetic meat or in vitro meat. And this is a very hypothetical scenario. What I find interesting about this scenario is that it tries to align with a number of values. And this is where I want to take a step back and look at the three cases that I presented, the three stories. So in the first case, what was missing was an inquiry into the values of the main stakeholders of the detergent. So how can you design a process or a product to align with stakeholder values? That is something that could have been better investigated, and that it was not just a question of eco-efficiency, but it was a big picture question. In the case of synthetic coffee, we see the risk we see what happens if we don't consider values like cultural heritage. And how can you make a product that could align with such a value and in another place? And in the last scenario of the pig in the backyard, you can see that there are scenarios we can think for the future where our values can be aligned and that we can come up with solutions that we wouldn't have thought of before. This process of designing and inquiring and aligning with stakeholder values is a method in ethics that we call value-sensitive design. And this is just one of the many methods that I wanted to tell you about today, because using this method is a way to fulfill our responsibility for the things we don't know. Because what we do know is that the more people we talk to, the more we are going to be able to see relevant values, and we might be able to find out how values conflict and how to move beyond those conflicts by also finding common ground. And also, it's very important to acknowledge and identify values of other people, because if we never have a conversation about them, we can never move forward. And I see Will has come back, so I will wrap up. But basically, this idea of reaching out, involving different stakeholders that are beyond your frame of action, beyond your comfort zone, this is a way to be responsible for the future together with others. And I wanted to give you a little set of questions that would be a bit more practical. So when you innovate, ask, what is my innovation replacing? What are the ripple effects of this replacement? And who could I work with to make this innovation socially sustainable? And if I think about 100 years from today, what will have radically changed for the better thanks to my innovation? So be curious, communicate, and don't be afraid to go out of your comfort zone and collaborate. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you so much. You've filled our heads with great questions and some very valuable principles. Just, in the last couple of years, design thinking has become part of the curriculum in many parts of the university, but this values-sensitive approach has not become integrated yet. And we feel so strongly that with food and the evolution of food, with all the dimensions you're talking about, the historical dimensions, the cultural dimensions, the social dimensions, the environmental dimensions, that it needs to be informed by this values sensitive design ethos. So thank you so much for those questions. I think the other point you make that really reaches home for me is to take a long view, to challenge us with what are the 100-year implications of our decisions is so profound in a community, particularly where Berkeley sits, in the heart of Silicon Valley, where everything is 24/7 and impatient and instant gratification. So I really appreciate you bringing that perspective in too. I see so many great questions coming in, and I know we're always going to be short on time, but where should we go? What advice do you have for our students here to go deeper in this? And what advice do you have for the faculty that are here? What should we be reading? Are you offering any courses online about value-sensitive design? How do we come along with you in the Netherlands, who are known as such trendsetters on values-based business?
Okay, well, to answer the first question, I think I tell students to go out of the walls of university and to listen, to be curious, because you learn so much about other people's experiences when you just go and expose yourself to their experiences. And then your role then is to see, okay, so how can I be relevant for these problems? And so yeah, just I think listening, I think that's something we can do more of in general. And then from an education perspective, I think one thing that goes along that is to create collaborations that might not be the usual collaborations. And as someone who works in a very interdisciplinary way, I know it's really hard because we don't always have the same language, we don't always have the same goals. So it's harder work, but the results are so much more meaningful because you create something very unique. And I really encourage this transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to come to also just new questions. So it's not even about the answer, but sometimes it's about what is the question we're trying to answer. I do think there's a massive online course about value-sensitive design. One word I might share is that it's a field that has been very much developed looking at artifacts. So how can you make a product value sensitive? And when you move to the realm of systems, it gets complicated and it gets exciting. So I'm working with that, looking at how to incorporate the ideas of shared responsibility with value sensitive design and with scenario thinking. So I'd be happy to share more about this also via written means.
Thank you so much. We want to incorporate that into our curriculum in our Transforming Food Systems and Sustainable Food Initiative work. So this is just a taste of what Zoe's been researching and writing about. I encourage you to visit her website. There's so many great questions too on the chat, and I'll just say one last thing before we go to the next session. What you're talking about of listening, working in interdisciplinary nature, harmonizing language between sectors, terminology. It reminds me of a principle that I think about a lot as a gardener, which is slow down to grow fast.
Yes, I love this. I will write this down. I will quote you on this. It's beautiful. Right. Yes, thank you.
So nice to see you.